Yeah, it's. I was wondering what we could do to effectively lobby the PLP, really, and who are the targets? You know, because obviously there are some who has won over, and it's So how can that be effective?
Yeah, great question. So the good news is I think that a large number of the PLP are actually pretty sympathetic. We've only got 203 members of the PLP, and there's probably at least 60 who are quite pro. It's hard to determine how many of the rest are really dead set against. I would suggest it's less than 60. One of the challenges we've got is that in a small parliamentary Labour Party, half of it is in the shadow cabinet or the front bench. And this is a very disciplined ship that Keir Starmer is running. And so many of those people are probably not going to come out very publicly. So to the what can you do? Well, first of all, definitely if you have a Labour MP, I mean, write to them, join in the lobby, which is being organised and in fact, I would say this to all of you, whoever your MP is, on the 12th of March, Make Votes Matter is running a lobby of parliamentarians. I think even if you think your MP is pro-PR, send them a message. Now, you might send them a message saying, I won't take your time up, your track record is brilliant, thank you so much, but send them some encouragement at least. But for all of the rest of them, sign up on Make Votes Matter. And I'll send you, by the way, afterwards, Alan, a list of sort of useful email addresses. But sign up for the parliamentary lobby. Invite them to a meeting. I mean, invite them to a public meeting. And I think if you are a sort of ordinary citizen who's not a Labour Party member and your MP is a Labour MP, approach them as ordinary citizen. You know, you've a right to understand what your MPs think about the world, including where they are on PR. I think, I mean, beyond that, there's not very many ways to skin a cat when you're trying to persuade parliamentarians of things, to be honest. I also think that they're probably collectively not really the main target, because I don't think that the PLP as a whole is going to be the thing that makes this rise or fall. I think a number will be. Now, who are the number? There's obviously the party leadership, then the elected party leadership in the shadow cabinet, but also the elected leadership of the governing body of the party, the National Executive Committee. I think that as we get nearer to conference, then making sure they've understood the strength of feeling from Labour members is really important, because the position that the National Executive Committee takes at conference makes a difference. There are 3 elected Labour MPs on the NEC. One of them is Johnny Reynolds, who's massively pro-PR, so that's great news. And then there are a couple who are, I'm a bit less certain where they are. And also don't stop at the Parliamentary Labour Party. Also, if you're in a trade union, the similar approach, write to your local branch or your local region, particularly for an active trade unionist, send a letter to the General Secretary otherwise, and particularly if you're in one of the 11 affiliated unions of the Labour Party, because they also need to understand the strength of feeling of Labour Party members. But the 12th of March, Great. Please join the lobby.
12th of March, got that. Thanks, Laura. Okay, let's go to Edward Kimberley, please, for your... Sean Hagan, if you've got anything to add to that question, because you had an early question about procedure as well, perhaps you could add that afterwards. So, Edward.
Hello. I'm just going to go back and scroll back up to my question. I put it in a little while ago. I'm in a marginal constituency, as it happens, one of those privileged few that is very interesting to the rest of the country because we happen to sit on that edge. We consistently fail to win it, though. The problem that I've got is I sense that there's a lot of opposition, especially from traditional people, no, as you would say, dyed-in-the-wool Labour people, is where the majority of the opposition seems to be coming from. My question would be, what would be the best way to go about reassuring people like that? And is proposing a motion to adopt PR as CLP policy the best way to go about it?
Well, that's a really good question, because in fact, proposing a motion for the Labour Party for anything is often not the best way to actually persuade people of anything. Unfortunately, it is the mechanism by which we get policy changed. I think if time allows, I think it would be really good for you to try to have an open discussion which isn't pinned around a motion, as a prelude to then putting a motion at a subsequent point. Because the problem with the way that the Labour Party debates its motions, I mean, it's a bit like Commons itself, and it depends on the culture of your own particular bit of it. But it's very binary. You know, I'm for, I get 3 minutes. You're against, you get 3. I'm for, I get 3. You're against, we get 3. We put our hands in the air. It's not a great way to really persuade anyone of anything. So I think taking a step back and looking at some of the more fundamental reasons about, you know, these people are really committed to the Labour Party, and they want the Labour Party to win, and sometimes that will cloud thinking about the tactics. But when it comes to the why, you know, these people have been in the Labour Party for 20, 30 years for very good reason. But why is it? It's about equality. It's about gender equality. It's about trade union rights. And there's a whole series of research has been done. And I'm going to just do a plug for a book about the impact that proportional systems can have on those fundamental outcomes. So I don't know if I'm holding this up properly, but this is called Peterloo 200. And it was produced to commemorate the 200 years since the Peterloo massacre. And it draws on research that's been done by academics about a whole series of societal outcomes and how these can be seen to be linked back to systems where you have PR. So it's not for nothing that only the UK and Belarus have got an attachment to first past the post, and we are just about the most unequal country in the OECD. In fact, the only one that's worse is the States, which also has a completely potty electoral system. But I'd be very surprised if you had the time for a sort of discussion if there weren't some areas of policy which have driven these people to join the party. I mean, another thing that I would recommend, which I haven't got a picture of, is Politics for the Many, which is a trade union grouping which has done work which looks at the impact that first past the post has had on levels of trade union recognition. And obviously, you know, the UK went very rapidly backwards and very quickly since Mrs. Thatcher. And then because of our system, we sort of swing from one government to another, and every time have tried, you know, Labour, when in power, clawed a little bit back of what it lost, but will never make the ground up completely. And if you look at the evidence from not just obviously Scandinavia, but countries across the world where they have proportional systems, they have higher levels of union recognition. There are lots of statistics around gender and gender equality in particular. I think that's the way into the discussion. Like, what was it 30 years ago that made you join the Labour Party? Like, what are the things that you really care about? With some younger members in particular, and not exclusively, then issues around climate change. There's evidence to suggest that there are lower emissions from countries that have proportional systems. Now, this isn't all, you know, there are lots of other reasons as well, of course, but clearly through PR, you end up with more consensual systems. I mean, back to my example of the last election, you know, can we imagine where British politics would be if we'd actually had 10 Caroline Lucases and not just one? So I guess I would start from the fundamental questions of principle and not dive in at the systems stuff. Also, because it's just a stultifyingly unexciting discussion, really. And it can also become quite exclusive, because you end up with it being dominated by the folk who get the maths. Can become quite a blokey thing, as well, dare I say. But yeah, I highly recommend this to everybody.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay. I've probably got two questions together now. So can we have the question from Teresa, please, followed by the question from Adrian Oldman. They're probably linked. Teresa, if you'd like to go first.
Oh, hello. Yeah, it was a question about the various forms of proportional representation and how important Laura and the Labour Party, they feel that maintaining a link to constituency representation in the House of Commons.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And Adrian, would you like to add your question to that as well?
Yeah. So mine is, I live in a constituency with a newly elected Tory MP. She cares only about her allegiance to the party and couldn't give a stuff about anything else. Where's the representation for people like me in having that local link? Thank you.
Well, perhaps I'll start with the second person first. I mean, heartfelt sympathies. Yeah, you're not represented. It's, I mean, you're just not. Nor are the vast majority of people. I think I read earlier on today that 3 out of 5 people in the last 5 elections, 3 out of 5 people when they voted have ended up not having the MP of the party that they voted for. Did that sentence make sense? So significant proportions of us are never represented. And so you're right that one of the arguments I think for having a constituency link but bigger constituencies is precisely that people like you finally will have an MP in their region of 3, 4 or 5 who does represent them. So a constituency link doesn't have to mean a singular constituency. And I mean, there are people on here who definitely know a lot more about PR systems than I do, but one of the ones that most Labour Party members seem to be committed to would be similar to the one that we have in Wales, where you have a certain proportion of MPs elected from first past the post and then a top-up list. That would enable you to retain a constituency link. It is to answer Teresa's point, it is probably the first thing that most MPs say of the not even objections, of the concerns that MPs in particular have. That's probably the first one that they raise. And we are studiously avoiding committing to a particular system at this stage in the campaign, but something else that I'd recommend to you if you've not seen it, which was originally drawn up by Make Votes Matter, is the Good Systems Agreement. And what Make Votes Matter did is they did an extensive piece of research looking at everybody else's PR systems and have come up with 10 principles which they think should underpin a good system. One of which is about accountability, so making sure that MPs and governments are accountable to the voters. One of the charges that's made about some systems is that you don't know who represents you at all. And although it doesn't say specifically, I think it's sort of implied throughout the Good Systems Agreement that a close link with a constituency would be part of it. I think that the Labour Party will probably have to have some sort of deliberative process after party conference to decide exactly what system it wants to settle on. But of course, the great irony of this debate is that we already have, and indeed blessed and supported and proposed by the Labour Party, proportional systems in Scotland and Wales. We have them for the GLA in London. So it's a bit of a myth that the Labour Party can't accept PR. It just hasn't accepted it yet for Westminster.
Excellent. Thanks, Laura. Yeah, some of the easiest arguments to dispel that about constituency. Just ask people how well they think they're represented now for their constituency.
Yeah, quite.
We've got a question from Deborah Finn. Deb, ask your question.
Okay, sorry. What was my question?
You asked, do you think the Labour leadership can't win in
Oh, yeah, I remember it.
2024?
Sorry, I got distracted by going away and eating my pizza.
Lucky you.
Yes, so I suppose I'm increasingly seeing the groups that I interact with. It's almost as though the message is filtering out slowly, that people are starting to say, yeah, we won't win in 2024, but we're aiming for the next one, as if the next one would be any better. And when I press them on it and say, you know, as nicely as I possibly can, kind of, okay, so what's your theory on why we would lose in 2024 and why we might win in the next one? They have no theory to back it up. Their theory is based on a simple pendulum, like the pendulum swings to the Tories, and then as though it's like a law of physics, it must swing back. And you say, well, actually, history isn't like that. Parties actually do rise and decline. That is what happens. It doesn't have to swing one way in the next. And they just say, well, I'll just wait and see. And so I am struggling at the level of kind of just ordinary Labour Party members, perhaps not very engaged activists, because I think the engaged activists know better, but just ordinary party members who have this naive impression that, well, it's gone Tory for so long, surely next time it must come back to Labour. And they don't understand the parliamentary arithmetic that makes it actually, in my mind, impossible, actually. Pretty much impossible for Labour to win next time, with Scotland gone, with the boundary changes coming in.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point. Some of it is probably because people, yeah, they just have very busy lives. And as you say, they're not really engaged activists. And so, you know, they're not burying through the statistics or the detail in the same way. Some of it might be less that or what you described as naivety and just not yet having got to the point of wanting to accept. I mean, I will eventually throw away those size 10 trousers, but I have dutifully folded them up and put them back in my cupboard every summer for the last 5 years because I just keep hoping that eventually I'm going to get in them. Now, at some point, I'm just going to recognize that I'm not, and they're going to quietly go to a jumble sale. But people feel very attached to the party and they don't want to contemplate the pendulum not swinging back. I mean, for me, part of the argument there is to talk to people about what's happening with this pendulum, because the truth is that it may swing back in electoral terms to the Labour Party, but in political terms, it is shifting in a rightwards direction.
Yeah.
You know, this is a really brutal government that we have at the moment. And one of the reasons we're in such a mess with COVID is because of austerity. And even if Corbyn had won, even in 2017, and even if we'd really won, we would still be now repairing and running to catch up with where we might have been had we just had the common sense to change this system in 1997 when we put it in our manifesto. So it is frustrating, I know, to be caught in that sort of going nowhere discussion. I think the only way into it is through the politics. What are people going to lose in the meantime? I mean, there's 4 million children in this country live in families with poverty. I mean, I'm trying to explain to my Italian family why it was such a big thing that the schools were shutting. And I said to one of them, yes, it's really a disaster that the schools are shutting because the kids can't eat. And they looked at me and said, oh, no, you mean learn. And they thought I just got the word wrong. And I said, no, I actually mean eat. Like, it's a disaster they're not going to school because they're not learning. But it's incredible that because they're not going to school, they're not eating. Now, Italy is a slightly poorer country than the UK, and in many ways its education system is not, in terms of some of the sort of pedagogy, is advanced, but you don't have to go to school in Italy to eat. So the thing to those Labour people, I think, is to just, we can't afford to wait. We can't afford to wait another 10 years for a broadly progressive government. And if this means some compromise around the edge, which means that Labour embraces, for me, it wouldn't be a compromise anyway, because in absolute terms, we need to do it. But for some of those people, okay, you compromise a bit on a system that you don't really like, and yes, you let go of a little bit of power, and you probably end up in a coalition. But we're really trying to draw equivalence between, Labour being in coalition with the Lib Dems and the Greens would be worse than having another Tory party. I don't believe that these Labour Party people believe that. They can't believe it. It doesn't stack up. Now, of course, life has been made hard for tribal Labourists by the fact that the Liberal Democrats have also tried to pretend that they are equidistant, which is also another myth. That they're not equidistant either. It's a nonsense, So both the parties have their problems, but it's incumbent upon Labour members to really get their heads around the fact what we're condemning the country to if we don't cooperate. And after all, there is a progressive majority in this country. It is under threat, but there is still a progressive majority. More people voted against the Tories than voted for them. And it is incumbent upon the Labour Party and Labour Party members to engage in thoughtful discussion with the rest of that progressive majority, including by demonstrating the best thing of good faith it could do and changing the voting system. Otherwise, we will be stuck with the Tories.
Yeah,
Thanks, Laura. That's a really strong strong message. Laura, we've had a number of questions about Scotland. Michael Richards has asked at least two. Michael, do you want to pick one of your questions?
Let me just unmute myself. Sorry about that. Essentially, what I'm saying is that the indie ref is coming, regardless of whether we want it or not. I mean, personally, I don't blame them for wanting to be free from the mess that's in Westminster. I'd rather not see the breakup of the union. But regardless how you feel about that, it's inevitable. I mean, how that's going to affect the electoral mathematics in the union, regardless of how you look at it, is it not? I mean, thoughts and feelings. That's all I'm asking, really.
Yes, you're right. It is going to have a profound impact. I think that without Scotland in the union, Labour would have to win 90 seats.
Sounds about right. Yeah.
Samuel Kind is smiling at me, which means that number is correct. Someone has said, can we talk about keeping Scotland in the UK by talking about PR? I'm not sure whether we can make that explicit, but there is definitely something about the Labour Party offering a broad sweep of constitutional reform which feels meaningful, including PR. And obviously, we're now having this discussion about the so-called Devo Max. I mean, it is quite clear that without some really concrete constitutional offer, all of the things being equal, Scotland will go. And yes, many of us are very conflicted. I mean, I campaigned against Brexit because I don't like borders, and I support freedom of movement because I don't like borders. And so I find myself personally, this is a purely personal view and nothing to do with Labour for New Democracy, very torn on this, because part of me thinks, well, yes, if I was a pro-European Scot at this point, I'd think sod it as well. On the other hand, I don't want a border. I don't want a border there either. But you're right; it's existential crisis time.
It's quite a serious. I'm not sure I was going to go with that, really, quite frankly.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
I probably would argue that the demonstration of good faith to political parties across the UK, which includes PR, is also a demonstration of good faith to the SNP. Now, I was slightly unconvinced, I think, about some of the tone. I support Keir Starmer's leadership. I was slightly unconvinced about some of the tone of his speech at the end of last year, which felt to me a little bit like a lecture to Scotland why it mustn't go. Actually, I think we should be telling a compelling story of a vision for the country, which means that Scots would want to stay. But then we've got to really mean it, because the last time we tried that, we ended up with hard Brexit, which nobody in Scotland voted for. So you're right, I don't have any very easy answers at all. I think it's a massive issue for the party. Quite how we got to this point is beyond me, but it doesn't seem to me that just battering SNP voters around the head with how wrong they are is the way to get out of it.
Interesting. Thanks, Laura.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Sue, you asked a question just a couple of minutes ago, quite a specific one. Would you mind asking it now? Sue, I don't have your surname.
Hi, Sue Ackroyd. I think somebody else also asked it, so I can't take credit for it completely, but is Laura in the new all-party parliamentary group for electoral reform? And also, what do you think it will achieve?
Very good question. If I had an answer to that. Well, so the all-party parliamentary groups are kind of MPs really, and then others of us hover around the edges. But I did go to the first meeting, which was held last week. Alex Sobel, who is a very loyal supporter of PR and one of the key MPs in the Labour campaign for electoral reform sort of stable, and a supporter of our coalition. He's going to chair it. What will it achieve? Well, the first very useful thing it could do would be to out all of those latent passive supporters of PR who are dotted around Parliament, not just in the Labour Party, but also including, because I think that there are large numbers who are sort of quietly for it, but don't like to say. I think it's going to have quite a broad agenda. It's going to look at other issues to do with voting reform, voting for 16-year-olds, resolving once and for all, or putting forward proposals, which hopefully then will be picked up, looking at issues around voter ID, which, as you know, are often seen, to be part of sort of voter suppression. In relation to the Labour campaign, it won't have a very specific outcome, because obviously as an all-party parliamentary group, it's sort of, it's everyone and no one and neutral. But I think it's going to be a useful forum for promoting the discussion. And of course, the discussion is sort of happening because the Labour Party is committed to a constitutional commission and the Conservative Party has committed to a constitutional convention. And neither have made PR explicit as part of their agenda. So one of the things I think we all hope the APPG will be able to do will be to exert some influence to make sure that PR does feature on both of those agendas, and it will take evidence, I imagine, and I hope that part of that will end up being looking at these issues that I waved this book around about the substantive, what happens to a country other than who wins or doesn't win, but what actually happens in terms of policy and public policy making in countries where you have PR. So I think it will be potentially a really interesting forum, and it's got at least a Conservative in there. It's obviously got the Green Party support and the Liberal Democrats. I imagine some SNP and some really great Labour MPs backing it. So I think they're going to publish a work plan probably in coming days.
Can I ask another question? It's a bit cheeky.
If you're quick.
Are you planning to stand for Parliament?
Oh no.
Oh.
I tried that one. I didn't get very far. Do you know, one thing that really makes me laugh is when people talk about how they don't like PR systems because of the party lists. And I just think, well, you've got party lists anyway, even without PR. And the thing, I fell foul of ours.
Oh, that's a shame. Thank you anyway.
Question and a quick answer, so thank you. Peter Crook, do you want to ask your question about the good? Peter, are you there?
Yes, yes, I am. Good evening, Laura. Isn't she doing fabulous? Isn't she wonderful, everybody? I can't believe how somebody can be so articulate and fence off all this stuff. And Alan with his penetrating questions. But there again, I am membership secretary for GetPRDone, so I'm bound to big him up a bit. And I'm also part of the Labour for New Democracy. Simple as that. I looked at the new systems agreement a while back, and I looked at the 10 points, couldn't disagree with it, because it's very sound. But there's 10 points. Laura, what would you take as the most important 3 or 4 that at this stage of the campaign, where we're trying to get through to Labour and get them to adopt PR, what would you say were the top 3 or 4 out of that document? Because it's too many, 10.
Well, I think that proportionality, so the first, just to read this to people, the first point of the Good Systems Agreement says, good systems ensure seats closely match votes with parliamentary representation at least as proportional as a Scottish Parliament. I think that's a good one to have in there for Labour people, because after all, it was Labour people that decided that to propose having a Scottish Parliament, and because we don't want some sort of fudge where things just get minorly a little bit better and everyone can carry on more or less with business as usual. So I think that that's really important. I think the local links, which is point 4, good systems maintain links between MPs and specific geographic areas. Doesn't describe it as a constituency link because it might be a bigger area, but I think that's probably very important for, you know, for winning support within the Labour Party. And then I don't know really if I'd like to pick, I guess maybe, well, thinking about Labour's mission to expand the electorate and in particular to appeal to people who may not be heavily engaged in politics and disadvantaged groups and people for whom there are other barriers to participating, I guess I might go for number 10, which is voting simplicity. And it just says good systems and ballot papers are easy for voters to understand and use, because I think that one of the attractions of first past the post is that you know who won. Now, they didn't sort of really win, but you know, you saw which horse got their nose over the line first. And so I think that that is quite important. And if I were a constituency MP trying to persuade people myself, I probably would want to say, and look, you know, it's not mega complicated. You don't have to do a PhD at the London School of Economics to be able to vote. And so I think that's probably quite important. Just to clarify, though, this Good Systems Agreement is a piece of work that Make Votes Matter is doing across all parties. It's got nearly all parties have signed up to it, and a number of Labour MPs and a Conservative. But it's not sort of an intrinsic part of our current campaign. It's the thing that we can wave at people when we don't want to go into a massive detail about discussion about systems.
Thank you, Laura.
Useful.
Excellent.
Thanks, Laura. I'm going to sneak in one last question, if you don't mind. Tony, are you around? Would you like to ask your question, please?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Oh, yes. Hello.
I'm not sure whether this is a question or a comment, but a bit of both. I'm one of the old hands from the 70s and 80s, and a lot about PR seems to me about what the Labour Party can and can't be, an issue that's been around for about 125 years and is unlikely to go away tomorrow. So is PR, the logic of it and the justification for it, that it's going to mean electing socialist MPs and fascist MPs but not radicalising the Labour Party?
That's interesting.
Sorry.
God, it was really going well until that one. I don't have a very easy answer. I don't think we'll elect many fascists, by the way. I think one of the arguments used against PR is that it lets extremists in. I mean, many more people more extreme than Priti Patel, quite honestly, I struggle to think of anyway. But the argument that we don't have extremists in because we've got first past the post, or we get them in when we don't have it, I'm not sure holds up. Would it curb the radicalization of the Labour Party? Potentially, but then there comes a point when a really radical party that can never get elected and a slightly less radical one that can, I think I'd probably go for the latter. But also, I think that there's every evidence, if you look at continental Europe, lots of things that we consider to be really radical are mainstream political fare in systems which have proportional representation, which also bring into them what we might call centrist parties. So lots of the things that were proposed, in the 2017 Labour Party manifesto, which were initially decried as sort of hugely radical, are absolutely bog standard, like owning your railways, taxing the rich. So would it curb the radicalisation of the Labour Party? I'm not sure. I think it might have the opposite effect, because at the moment, one of the things that happens under first past the post is that you have to chase after marginal voters. We had Mondeo Man in 2005-6, and then in the last election we had Workington Man. Nobody was chasing after Wandsworth Road Woman. I used to live in South London, where Wandsworth Road Woman is, quite likely to be black, quite likely to be in council housing or in extortionately priced private rented accommodation, quite likely to be working in public services. One of the frontline workers at the moment who's really getting it in the neck. And a more radical offer. I would like a party to be able to make a more radical offering for Wandsworth Road Woman, because it knows that it can still win, than be chasing after Mondeo Man, because it's concerned that otherwise it can't. So it might have the opposite effect. It may enable us to have a more radical political offering, because we're not chasing after these 50,000 people in a very narrow demographic, in a small number of seats, who we think we need to win, who are swing voters. So actually, I think it could have the opposite effect on the party.
Really interesting. Thanks, Laura. I did a really interesting thought out answer to that fairly tricky question. Well, that's it. We've reached the end. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming along this evening. And many, many thanks to Laura for giving up her time.